the beacon for the nation.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good evening, coming to you from County 032. My name is Faisal, and welcome to Live Roll Talk. And tonight we'll be talking about a matter that has caused some sort of murmuring, especially in the humanitarian sector. I'm talking about the immediate closure, or rather the 40 days ultimatum given by the government of Kenya, of course, to close the Daadab and Kakuma refugee camps. Of course, the government is citing some security matters in the country being one of the main reasons why they are closing down these camps. And joining me in studio is none other than Dr. Kanenje from the Horn Institute, who will help me to dissect this particular matter. Dr. Kanenje, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thanks so much for making time for us this evening, Dr. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too. It's a pleasure.
Always a pleasure. I mean, talking to you, it's amazing. Tonight, as I told you, it's reversing roles. I'm used to being in the studio and then my guest joining me virtually, but tonight is happening differently.
That's why it's kind of a reverse.
Yes, reversing roles. Thank you so much, Dr. Now, Dr. Kanenje, going straight into the topic, CS Matiang'i on the closure of the Daadab and Kakuma refugee camps. Before we delve into the matter deeply, what exactly do you take out of this?
I think what the CS tried to do is what Kenya has been trying to do in the last couple of years. We remember the last time Kenya declared intention to close the Daadab refugee camp was back in 2016. Of course, in which case the High Court ruled that decision was unconstitutional because Kenya is signatory to existing international conventions, especially on refugee law.
First, before delving into the matter, I just want to get your opinion on that. I mean, what do you think about that? Coming at such a time where the world has been hit by a very tough thing that has forced the president had the role today in his address to the nation to close down some counties in the country and put on some more strict measures for as far as curbing this COVID-19 pandemic is concerned. What exactly do you take of the government's action to close down the camps at this point?
Yeah, I think what the government is trying to do, first of all, it appears to be very dramatic. And I think there are a lot of people who may question the timing and the appropriateness of the timing. But what I can see coming from Nairobi, it is an effort to force the international community to do something about refugee camps. Not just because of the potential risks, but also because they seem to have existed in perpetuity, and the international community seems to have gotten comfortable with this kind of status quo. And frankly speaking, it is not sustainable. Now, the challenge, though, is where do these people go? As much as we know, many of them have been in refugee camps for the last 3 decades. Many of them were actually born there. And when we have to go with international conventions, we are supposed to allow for voluntary repatriation, for instance. Of course, this is not something that is seriously being explored. But I think because of the dynamics and just complacency when it comes to refugees and the international fatigue, especially in dealing with refugees in Kenya in particular, I think is what is pushing Nairobi to try and exert pressure on the international community to do something about the refugee problem in the country.
Dr. What the government cited as the main reason for closing down these camps was the security matters, and you've just mentioned some two points. One being the first attempts to close down these refugee camps in 2014. Of course, the government at that time citing sustainability, right? So the issue, or rather the question that begs at this point in time is security really the matter, or is sustainability the issue, or is this part of the bargaining tactic? Does the government want something from the international community?
Faisal, I think it's a confluence of factors. And in terms of security, there's credible evidence, especially from intelligence reports, that the 2013 and 2015 attacks were in part planned or at least aided by persons from these refugee camps. And so that is true. And that doesn't mean the problem has gone away. You know, anytime you have a population that is less than active, that sometimes may not have hope for the future, it becomes prime suspects in terms of being mobilized. They become easy victims, what we call at risk, communities. And so that is one of the reasons. I think another reason is it's been 30 years and counting. And frankly, the world seems to be focused on everything else but refugees in Africa. They seem to be doing much more with refugees in Syria and other places than East Africa. And we know that at some point, Daadab was the world's largest refugee camp and is still one of the largest. Yeah. And so I think the recognition that this may continue without end, it's partly what is also informing this dynamic. The third one, what I suspect, perhaps from a political diplomatic front, is there is an increasing sense that the continuing instability and what is perhaps seen from Nairobi as unwillingness to cooperate by the brotherly country of Somalia, it's not going to help in settling the refugee problem. Because remember, if they have to be repatriated, there has to be a mechanism that has to be worked out between Nairobi, UNHCR, and Mogadishu. But Mogadishu, I think, is increasingly being seen as an ungrateful neighbor, in part because of perhaps the kind of attitude we've seen from Mogadishu, which of course in Nairobi is perceived as unfair. Of course, some of these things are subject, of course, to interpretation. But I think Nairobi is finding itself in a place where it views the world as having abandoned its own refugee problem here, and that it's living in a neighborhood with a neighbor who potentially is not going to cooperate when it comes to working out potential repatriation of refugees.
Thanks much, Daktari. And in your answer, you have preempted my next question. I mean, I'm still trying to dig and make a point of what exactly is happening, trying to get a clear picture of the reason behind this. And I could not help my mind from wandering towards the line of, is there a possibility of the recent maritime conflicts between Kenya and neighboring Somalia? We all know about the romance that was existing before the raid died off. We know about the delicate relationship that these two countries share at this point in time. I don't know, can this be one of the reasons as to why the government is deciding just to flex its muscle a little bit? I mean, is there a possibility to link this to
crisis, especially diplomatic fallout, and of course the Somalia taking Kenya to the ICJ are not the main reasons, but they've added fuel to the fire. I think they've created an environment where Nairobi believes it's not likely to get any form of cooperation from Mogadishu, and therefore when it comes to the refugee crisis, they think they may have to take it back to the international community to figure out and come up with a roadmap, essentially, on how they're going to take these refugees back. Because there are lots of economic, security, and other issues that are associated, of course, with having refugees. Now, some of us have always advocated for a more wider regional program, for instance, of sharing refugees, or providing a path to citizenship for some refugees, for instance, since some of them don't know any other place to go. But I think the international efforts have been limited. in trying to help, especially host countries, move in the direction of actually providing a more comfortable environment for refugees. And so Nairobi, being a host of the largest refugees around the region, I think there is a perception and a sense that they've been abandoned, and therefore they just want to find a roadmap that is going to take the refugees back to where they came from. Of course, which again presents a lots of complexities, both in Kenya and outside.
Dr. Good that you gave a comprehensive answer to that. I don't think I need to ask again what is the fate or what is the future of these refugees, because you've made it clear that they need to go back to where they come from. Of course, this is the Kenyan government, but how realistic that is, I guess that's a topic for another discussion, right?
Can you come again?
I'm saying, Doc, you gave a very comprehensive answer that kind of answered my next question, which I wanted to ask about the realistic. How realistic is it for these people, these refugees in Kakuma and Daadab, right, to move back, to be repatriated back to their country within the 7 days or 14 days ultimatum that they're going to get, right?
Thanks, Faisal. I think the 14-day was the time given to UNHCR to come up with a timeline, with a roadmap on how they are going to repatriate the refugees. Expecting refugees to be moved within 14 days is unrealistic, is a pipe dream. So that cannot happen. However, my understanding is that was the time given for the international community to come up with a roadmap. Now, the challenge is the 190,000 in Kakuma, for instance, they may not exactly find a viable and safe place in South Sudan, since most of them come from there. And the perhaps 400,000 in Kakuma, or rather in Daadab, knowing what we know about Somalia, the environment is just not very conducive for them to settle. I think the trouble, though, is that no one is coming out with an alternative plan of resettling the refugees or helping them to go back and restart their lives. And I think that is one thing that may be frustrating Nairobi. I'm not doing a brief for Nairobi. I'm just trying to do the analysis, at least trying to get the thinking on the part of Nairobi in terms of what informed its decision to give the international community an ultimatum.
Perfect. Thank you. Now, moving on to another sensitive matter. Now, from where you are sitting as a researcher, as an analyst, an expert, especially on matter security, what do you think is going to be the future of the diplomatic ties between Kenya and especially the countries?
It is very unfortunate with the kind of relations that are existing today between Mogadishu and Nairobi, because these are two countries, frankly speaking, that are tied at the hip. They are so connected, they are culturally, historically, they're more or less one nation. However, we also understand that politics sometimes has a way of driving a wedge between brothers and between neighbors. And when you make an analysis of all this, you realize the maritime issue, for instance, is a very nationalist issue in terms of political mobilization in Somalia. And so we do not, I think, expect any significant changes, I think, until after the election. I think that is what most analysts think. And ultimately, Nairobi and Mogadishu will have to talk, because even just taking the case of the maritime issue, for instance, whichever way the court rules, if it's going to rule in favor of one country over the other, the loser is not going to accept it. For Kenya, for instance, one of the arguments is if the ruling is against it, it may essentially become a landlocked country. And of course, they will not accept it. In Somalia, this is a very nationalistic issue that I don't think the current leadership is able to demonstrate that they're going to make compromises with Nairobi. And so I think until the elections is over, and perhaps there is a different understanding, and depending on the ruling that is coming from the International Court, I think these two countries will ultimately have to sit together and solve their maritime issues, and perhaps try to restore diplomatic relations, because they cannot do without each other. I think both the countries need each other.
Thanks so much, Doc, for that answer. My question is exactly was rather on not just Kenya and Somalia, but Kenya and the international community, the European countries and the American countries, that most of them were being sympathetic and empathetic to Kenya. And of course, they were donating so much to Kenya, supporting the refugee programs, right? Because of the that Kenya has been so generous and so welcoming, especially to the neighboring countries, talk of Sudan, South Sudan, and Somalia for the matter. So, what exactly is going to be what's the future of these diplomatic ties between Kenya and the American countries and the European countries for that matter, who have been donating big time to the country to support the refugee program?
Yeah, I think Kenya being a host to refugees has been a plus, by and large. It was a plus when Kenya was seeking, to get in the United Nations Security Council. It is a plus in lots of Kenya's engagements out there. And I think fundamentally, the diplomatic relations with especially Western partners is not going to change, because it is important to know the national interest of those countries. And a lot of them are not exactly in refugees per se. That's normally seen as a humanitarian thing. And so the fundamental relationship that they have with Nairobi are unlikely to change. Now, when it comes to support to the country, in especially keeping refugees, in terms of the net gain to the economy, it's actually not significant if you have to look at the contribution to the GDP, because most of these resources are going towards maintaining refugees anyway, who could actually be doing a better economic activity elsewhere in building their own countries, or let's say in building even this country, for instance. And so that is likely to fundamentally change. What, of course, may change is some perceptions of what Kenya does and what Kenya is willing to accept. And if countries have to be honest with themselves, then you realize that even those European countries, if you just go by the recent example of Syrian refugees, they were paying Turkey to make sure they keep refugees there. Reason? Because no one wants to keep refugees. No one wants to deal with the challenges of refugees. Now, as an anchor state in this region, we have no choice but, of course, to help our neighbors. But at the same time, you don't want to keep someone a refugee in perpetuity. It's not good for them, neither is it good for you. And so that's why we need a regional international approach towards solving the refugee problem, especially now that Somalia is slowly rebuilding. South Sudan, the peace is still slowly holding, that these refugees find a way of being taken back, and those who can be accommodated by neighboring countries, for instance, or those who may qualify, perhaps some laws may be changed in a number of these countries to provide a path to citizenship to some of them who know no other country but the host countries or where they were born.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Dr. for your answer again on that. Now, Doc, in the interest of time, I just want to touch on yet another theme of our discussion tonight, and that's the whole aspect to do with security. Dr. from where you see it, you've been an expert and an analyst, and a researcher. How do you describe the state of the security in this country as we are right now?
I think the country is facing a tough time. First of all, there is COVID-19, which is real, and I think observers need to pay attention to that. It's actually a serious national security issue, and I think that is why perhaps President Uhuru decided to take the kind of measures he took today. They are not very popular. Of course, they're going to deny some people some of their livelihoods, but that's meant to save lives. Now, outside that, we understand that we are living in a region that is still very volatile. The stalemate in Somali elections poses serious challenges to Kenya's security. The conflict in Ethiopia, of course, which has not been completed, it also poses security problems for us. We are still hoping that the transition in Sudan holds so that we do not find ourselves in conflict. In South Sudan, we know that we are key in also trying to help them ensure that they stabilize. And so the security in the country is also reflective of some of the dynamics that are going on around the country that are leading to proliferation of small arms, which now number into hundreds of thousands in private hands. But the COVID pandemic is also causing dislocation. Joblessness and lack of livelihoods, of course, increases insecurity naturally. And so this is a very delicate time for our country. Not to mention, we have evidence, and for those of us, of course, who do research in security, that Al-Shabaab and ISIS have exploited the weaknesses of the pandemic to create new narratives, to try and expand their following, and expand their reach, pretty much. And so it's a delicate time that I think not just as Kenyans, but as people in this region, we need to pay very close attention, because even the political situation is very fluid all around. Countries going into elections, you know what has been happening, all around the region. And so we should not take peace, or the peace we've enjoyed for the last few years, for granted. And as Kenyans, I think we should really pay attention and make sure we do not try to create alliances based on ethnicity, on class and stuff like that, because these narratives are not very helpful for long-term stability of the country or the region.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Kanenje, for that answer. Now, as we bidding goodbye, and I'm welcoming you to give your parting shot, that you have mentioned about the current situation of security, and of course, how the government is trying to look into that matter. Now, Doc, talking to the layman, viewers back at home, right? There are quite some loopholes to understand from your answer for as far as the security structure is concerned in this country, especially with this pandemic. On that note, how can the viewers back at home, we the common people, the common Mwananchi, what can we do to better the situation of security in the country currently as it is?
I think one of the challenge of the African state and the African citizen is the attitudes towards government. We tend to remove ourselves from government, forgetting we are actually government. We create these governments and we run them. Now, security is not a government function alone. It's actually a citizen function. Countries that are more peaceful, it depends less on their militaries and more on their citizens. And so if we decide to be our brothers' keepers and our sisters' keepers, so that when we see something, we say something. So when there's someone amidst us who is planning to cause us harm, we make sure we take care of that person, we report them, or we form through the so-called nyumba kumi of our own, if we don't have our own, to make sure those people do not thrive in our communities. But at this time, especially with the lockdowns and stuff like that, to expect government alone to give us security is going to be virtually impossible. So it's the responsibility of our communities to band together. We need to know each other, to make sure we don't have strangers that we don't know in our neighborhoods. That when we are seeing crazy things happening or suspicious things, we need to make a follow-up, because that's the only way we're going to prevent crime. That is the only way we're going to prevent terrorist infiltration. That is the only way we're going to prevent gangs from growing, from building up. In the absence of that, it's going to be very, very difficult to expect that the government alone to do it. And communities that are going to do that, you're going to enjoy much more security. You're going to see it, And so To me, that will be my advice, to Kenyans and to Muslims who are watching, that we need to be our brother's keeper. We need to be our sister's keeper. Soon we're going into Ramadan, inshallah, in about 2 weeks. We are going to need to have to provide that for one another.
Wow, wow, wow. Thank you so much. Powerful answer and powerful advice coming to you right there from County 057. And thanks to technology, I mean, County 037, we are able to communicate. Thank you so much, Dr. Kanenje, for making time for us this evening. And of course, for your feedback. I really wish to thank all those who have made this interview possible tonight, from the producer, that is Brother Abu Sufyan Ahmed, my producer back in Nairobi, Manchester, Ibrahim Muhammad, the head technical operator, Hassan Idris. And I cannot finish this without thanking Amina from my side, who has been my director tonight, right here in County 032. Amina, thank you so much. Asante sana, Amina. My director, actually, all these that you see, I told you that I don't have the permission, but I have a plan for you to see everything that she did for to do this show right here tonight. Now, I'll say this again, and I don't think I'll say this enough. Every time we are pointing a finger, remember, fingers are pointing back at you. Yes, I've said this before, and I've said this, and I've said this. But it seems like the message is not to allow me to say it again and again. Every time you're pointing a finger, remember there are 3 fingers pointing back. So the best question to ask yourself at that point is, what is your contribution onto the matter? As Kenyans, and especially as Muslims, we are in an entitled position. We are always, or often, so entitled, always thinking about our rights and forgetting about our ability. So please do me a favor. The next time, before opening your mouth and asking about your right, be it from your leadership, be it from the local administration, just ask yourself, what is your responsibility as a Muslim, as a human, and as a Kenyan citizen in this country? As Sheikh Ibrahim Lithome likes to say, we're not Kenyans by mistake. Allah wanted us to be Kenyans, and that's why we're Kenyans. So every time, before we ask about our rights, ask ourselves about our responsibility, and if we've been able to fulfill those responsibilities before we start asking for our rights. I've been your host, Faisal Kassim, and from County 032, Nakuru County. Sorry, it's Nakuru County, Festu area, right? Festu, yeah? Festu. And this is my Ocha, by the way. That's a shame. Ocha is rural areas, rural area on my side as well. So that's I'm here, and I'm down here for 2 days. So, ciao. See you in the studio, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.